Good afternoon. This is Adrienne Payne-Andrews, and I'd like to welcome you to the Healthy Communities Initiative webinar, How the Public Health Law Center Can Help You. We have Mary Marrow and Natasha Frost today who are going to discuss how legal technical assistance works using examples from the Healthy Communities Initiative. They'll also discuss resources they're developing and themes that they are seeing in their work. On the line today, we have Jeff Usher, Sean Brown, and Lisa Buller with Kansas Health Foundation, Natasha Frost and Mary Morrow with Public Health Law Center, and Vicki James with Healthy Kids Challenge. Mary and Natasha will begin the discussion with a slide presentation and allow time for questions at the end. And then during the last 30 minutes, 1 to 1:30, Sean will facilitate additional discussion and networking time. We have a few housekeeping items before we begin. As with previous webinars, all of your lines are muted. If you have not keyed in your audio pin shown after joining the webinar, please do so, as that allows your line to be unmuted later for the networking portion of the call. If you have a question, please type it into the box on the right side of your screen, and Jeff, Sean, or Lisa will read the questions for Mary and Natasha at the end of their presentation. And finally, the webinar is being recorded and will be archived on SharePoint. Again, please mute your line. I'm hearing a little bit of something in the background. Great. Thank you. Jeff, I'll turn it over to you.
Well, I just want to welcome everyone to the webinar. Usually I would give detailed information about our presenters, but I think everyone has sufficiently been introduced to either Natasha or Mary from the Public Health Law Center. Of course, these webinars are, we hope to do a couple things with them. One of them is to provide some good information to all the healthy communities. The other is to provide an opportunity for the communities to share. So as you listen to the webinar, think about things you might be proud of, things that you might have challenges with, so that we can all share what those might be, and we will have an opportunity both to answer questions from Mary and Natasha after their presentation, but also that last half hour for networking opportunity in which Sean will kind of facilitate. So with that, I'll turn it over to Mary and Natasha.
Great, thank you very much, and thanks everyone for being here. So today we're going to talk about the various ways that the Public Health Law Center has been involved in your efforts at the local level, and we're going to identify some examples of the technical assistance that we've provided, identify kind of how we do that, talk through our process, and also talk about some of the resources that we're developing to help move your efforts forward now that the majority of you have decided on a policy priority. So, but we want to leave enough time at the end of this presentation to really dive in and figure out what your needs are, how the information is communicated, and allow enough time for those questions at the end. So as you know, Mary and I are at the Public Health Law Center in St. Paul, Minnesota, and we work on a variety of efforts around the country, including in Kansas. And we're just really excited to be able to be working with you at the local level. We feel like it's really informing our work in a lot of other areas in the country. In fact, you know, Mary right now is up in Duluth, Minnesota, attending a food access summit and is sharing stories about how we're working with Kansas communities and really highlighting some of the great work that you're doing. So I feel like we say this every single time we talk to you, but it's really important. One of the ways that we work with you is to try and provide legal technical assistance, but we cannot take the place of your attorneys. We do not become your attorneys. We are not giving you legal advice, but just more legal technical assistance. And so there's a very important distinction there. And so if you come across a problem that you need assistance from an attorney, we recommend that you contact your attorneys for those sorts of issues. We also just want to highlight, because we're talking about policy priorities today, and just want to really flag again that there's this great webinar that the Kansas Health Foundation put together with some great partners from the Alliance for Justice, and they talk about that distinction between advocacy and lobbying. And it's really an important distinction, and as you really gear up to move forward on your efforts, I just would encourage you to revisit that issue, make sure that you understand it, and understand where that line is. And so one great way to do that is just to go on go into SharePoint, and that webinar is actually archived on SharePoint. All right, so what we've been doing with you all in various local governments is kind of trying to figure out where the current policy landscape is at, depending on which effort that you've chosen. So sometimes I feel like it's like you're going through a tunnel at a high rate of pace. We've really tried to look around, try and figure out where you're at, try and identify where each of your communities is at for policy so that you can make the right decision and informed decision, rather than just taking a right or a left based on no information. We try and fill in these signs to help guide you through the various different efforts that you're trying to figure out. And we do this by looking at your current landscape, and we're going to talk about how we've done that in your individual communities, but we also try and identify themes and identify community needs. So some of those needs are listed here. It's on these calls, we're working with our TA partners on trying to figure out how all the pieces connect. So some of the things that we are doing as a TA team, not just the Public Health Law Center, but the rest of the team, is trying to identify sample policy language for your policy priorities. We've got some great partners on how you message those policies within your communities. We're working together as a team to figure out how other communities are working on your topics, and so to connect you and learn from each other. We're also trying to link in other great TA providers, other points of sources for support for your efforts. And we're also, considering some regional trainings in the, in the next 3 years to try and identify ways to support your efforts. So those are kind of these overarching things that we're hoping to do to support your efforts over the next 3 years. And one of the things that we really are realizing is one of the best ways that the Public Health Law Center can help support you is kind of the Civics 101, the figuring out how local policy change works, figuring out how, how do you get an ordinance passed in your community? What is the zoning regulations? Those sorts of things that impact your work. And so we are working on several resources that we're going to highlight today that really try and figure out how your policy priorities fits within how policy change works within your community. And what we found, and we've said this in previous webinars, but what we found is that there's a very big difference between governmental policy change and non-governmental policy change. And so our focus with your policy priorities has really been on that governmental policy change. So how do you get a publicly appointed food policy council, or how can you promote active transportation by developing a bike and pedestrian master plan? Those are governmental actions and policy priorities. There are some of you who are exploring some non-governmental policies, for example, a food policy council that's actually managed and maintained by a nonprofit, for example. That would be a kind of non-governmental policy change that we are working on in your communities. So that's kind of a snapshot of kind of the overarching of what we're doing, and we're doing a lot of this, through kind of the, not quite this old-fashioned, but through phone calls. But I do want to just point out that we will be a part of the October training, and I think we're going to really dig in with some of the resources that we're creating. But we've been really excited to be able to participate on the phone calls as you've been developing these policy priorities over the last 4 months. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mary to talk about some of the themes that affect a lot of the work that you're doing that aren't specific to healthy eating or healthy food access and active transportation, but actually kind of cover several of the areas that we're working on with your communities.
Great. Thanks, Natasha. And as she mentioned, I am in Duluth, Minnesota at this Food Access Summit, which has been really exciting to hear about what local communities in Minnesota are doing, and also to see some of the overlap with some of these local efforts with what you in Kansas are doing. And so one of the speakers at the conference here is Mark Winnie, which I know some of you have had the chance to become familiar with him and his work with Food Policy Council. So it'll be really fun to hear kind of updates from him and bring that back into our work with you and see how, what opportunities there might be to work with him as well. But as Natasha mentioned, there have been some kind of broader themes outside of the healthy eating or active transportation arenas that we are starting to see that are, I think, informing some of our approach to your efforts and the policy priorities that you're working on. And one of the things, I think we talked about interlocal agreements in the last webinar, and it's been interesting in the past couple of months since our June webinar, just the conversations with communities and questions that have come up as to how different types of local governments, say between more than one city, between the city and a county, and also even some questions about between cities and counties and tribes have come up, and how local governments can enter into agreements with different governmental entities to move forward on issues or concerns that go beyond any specific boundaries. And so we are seeing a lot of potential for interlocal agreements and are putting together some resources, doing research about how interlocal agreements have been used in Kansas by different local governments. And I just want to add that it's not just cities and counties and unincorporated townships, but also some potential of working with school districts and other levels of government depending on what the specific issue area is. And so I think that one resource that we're trying to develop and working on with you is how interlocal governments can help support your efforts. We've heard from some folks that sometimes interlocal agreements can be, I don't want to say problematic, but some challenges can come up in the use of interlocal agreements, but it doesn't mean that they can't be effective tools. There just might be some considerations about how to navigate between, say, a county and a city if one or the other is more dominant and or investing more resources in a certain area than others. But we are putting together an assessment, a memo, and some information on how interlocal government agreements work in Kansas, looking for specific examples about how they've come up and how they might directly contribute to the work that you're doing. Then the next, and another area that we've been working on, and it seems like a really common theme for folks too, is just this idea of local planning. And a number of communities, and we'll be looking at that a little bit later, have identified working with their comprehensive planning process or community planning process as a way to advance either healthy eating or active living. And some of the questions that have come up are, well, what are the legal requirements for planning by local governments in Kansas? And so we've identified some of the Kansas laws that direct and guide both at the city and county levels the planning process. And then we're also, as Natasha mentioned, we're looking at reaching out to other technical experts in the planning field, because that's a whole profession in and of itself, and are hoping to be able to work with people like Stephen Hardy and others to identify some best practices and some tools for communities in their planning process. Because one of the things that's come up that communities in our calls with you have I think, consistently mentioned is that they're excited about the planning process, but they want it to be meaningful. You want it to be meaningful. And people have had a varied experience with different planning processes. Some have been more and less successful. And so I think it's a really good conversation to have at this point in the process with planning as to what are the lessons learned from previous planning efforts, where have there been successes, is there room for improvement, what kinds of lessons learned can we take from other experiences. What best practices are there from the planning field? And this is where, working with some of these other experts in local planning, and especially planning in Kansas, can, I think, help inform some of the resources that we're going to be providing to you. And then also, I think another really critical piece of this local planning process is how to keep communities involved and engaged, because some people have been concerned that sometimes local communities see the planning process as something that happens over there in a government entity, in a department or something, and community members that may be really excited and enthusiastic around, say, a recreational trail project or a food policy council or something like that, sometimes feel disconnected from the planning process. And that's where I think that there is maybe some potential to look at how the planning process is structured and how to really make sure that there's community engagement and input that's part of that process. Another, I think, piece that kind of ties into that community engagement and involvement component to the planning process and other policy priorities you've identified is this Kansas Open Meeting Act, and just questions about transparency, sunshine laws, things that really ensure that the public and community members are engaged and have a place at the table in decisions that are being made about your communities. And so we are in the process of developing a memo and just kind of an overview of how the Kansas Open Meeting Act applies to some of the areas that you're interested in, specifically thinking about, say, a publicly appointed food policy council, a publicly appointed active transportation council or committee. I mean, I think that the Open Meeting Act can be a real tool to ensure that that there's engagement with the community and the government decision makers, and that it's a conversation that continues even beyond actually just getting the policy established.
And so with those themes, and there are many more themes that we've identified. We didn't want to go through all of them today, and we've talked about the majority of them in previous webinars. But we also are incorporating, in addition to those legal themes, we're linking into our various partners around the country who are working on the same efforts that you're working on in Kansas. And there's a lot of momentum behind local level policy change related to active transportation and access to healthy food access. And so we are also bringing to bear, and we are not alone in this, our TA partners are also doing this. We're bringing those discussions, those resources, and those kind of lessons learned to our work in Kansas, and are, but at the same time, trying to be a filter for you. You guys have a lot on your plate to do, a lot of work, and a lot of hard work. And so one of our roles with our other, the other TA providers, we really see our role as trying to kind of filter through some of those resources that are at the national level or in other states, and try and filter them so that you can maximize your time through reading, instead of reading 10 resources on, for example, food, nutrition and food standards for healthy vending. We can identify kind of the top 2 or the top 3 that are being used with our national partners or with communities around the country. And so that's another role that we've identified to help you in your efforts. And so over the course of the last, as I said, 4 months, people have been trying to hone in on their policy priorities. And there was, a looming deadline of September 1st so that we could really help prepare and construct a October training that would be useful for you and would really help you move forward in your local efforts. And so each of you had generally picked between the healthy food access and active transportation. And so it was just a matter of figuring out how you fit into the, which policy priorities you were going to pick. And we identified several options for you and several legal issues that came up in previous webinars. And so as you, are moving forward, we would encourage you to, for example, we did a legal issues webinar that covered all of these issues related to healthy eating. And so that was in June. And so if you are interested in identifying legal issues, related to your efforts, please go back and review that. But we also think that that information is going to be filtered through as you pick your different priorities. And so we have kind of sorted through the policy priorities you've picked. And I'm going to cover the healthy food access folks, and Mary is going to go over the active transportation folks. And I think that for those of you on the call who are in the undecided category, I have to acknowledge, number one, Sydney County has decided we didn't get the chart updated in time for the webinar because they decided a couple days ago, and so we're really excited about that. But also, we know that you're really, really close. And so we're really excited to have this chart be, delete all the undecideds at the bottom of the chart in the coming few weeks. So there's 4 main areas that we are moving forward with 9 communities. And they are Food Policy Council, and this is related specifically to healthy food access. So it's Food Policy Councils, governmental nutrition standards, healthy vending or concessions in bids and contracts, and then land bank policies. And so I'm going to cover the first 3. We're going to talk about what we've done and how we've worked with these communities that are listed here. And then Mary is going to finish up with the land bank discussion. But I want to, again, make a plug for the October training because we are going to be working on really honing our resources and honing our technical assistance and connecting the dots for folks during that training. And so we're really excited. This is just kind of a preview on one little piece of what that training is going to be. So Food Policy Councils. We're really excited. We've got a couple folks who are who have picked a Food Policy Council policy priority. And so what we've done currently is we have developed a memo that actually outlines kind of the pros and the cons related to picking either a publicly appointed Food Policy Council or a nonprofit structure. And so that memo helped formulate kind of a pro and con list. And we also are beginning to identify what kind of language is out there. Like, how are these food policy councils actually created, specifically focused on the publicly appointed food policy councils? Because for publicly appointed food policy councils, the way you do those is you have to go, the local government has to either have a resolution or an ordinance or some sort of written guidance on how it's structured. And in previous webinars, and actually not just ours, but others that have been provided to the HCI community, people have identified kind of what those key pieces are. And so we're currently in the process of developing materials that will give your communities some choices on what policy language could look like, and linking it to actual proven food policy councils that have worked and who have functioned. And we're also going to be working to try and get a list together of the various policies that food policy councils can actually look into once they've been created. Obviously, that's a step down the road for you folks, because getting the council created is your first step. But we're trying to look ahead and figure out what we can do to help support you. And one of what we identified is in one of the communities, for example, that's exploring a food policy council who's not on the list, but they haven't decided quite yet. We identified that there is actually a current food policy council within their county that might not be currently functioning, but might give some great hints as to how to structure a successful food policy council moving forward. And so that's one way that we get into kind of what's going on in your local landscape, and we were able to identify what is essentially a now defunct food policy council, but point that county to kind of a reaching out and trying to find more information about that group. So that's just kind of how we've been able to support work on food policy councils. And I will say that we are doing some work. Many of you are going to be attending the Food Hub meeting. We are going to be presenting at that meeting and linking in how the Food Policy Council policy priority fits into Food Hub efforts. So that's the work that we've been doing on food policy councils. Two communities have picked what we're calling governmental nutrition standard policies. And these look really different depending on what your local government looks like. For example, one of the groups came out and they wanted to get healthier food into the vending machines, and at concessions as well. But they realized that there were no contracts or any sort of existing structures to do that. And so the way that they're going to need to incorporate governmental nutrition standards is actually to have their local government adopt nutritional standards at the governmental level. And so this is a way that two communities are trying to impact the food environment. And so they're going to be working on, the policy priority is to work on resolutions or local level policies that incorporate governmental nutrition standards. And so this is going to be really a useful, we're going to develop several useful tools that will help you in your other efforts as well, but things like, okay, well, what are the best nutritional standards out there? We're working with our the other folks on the TA team to try and sort through all the different nutritional standards that are being kind of heralded as the best. And then translating that into, okay, well, then if we pick that nutrition standard, what does that look like? What does that policy look like? How can we draft that policy to ensure that we're actually accomplishing our goal of getting those nutritional standards into our Park and Rec department, for example. And so the governmental nutrition standards we're developing, first of all, what we've done with communities is we've actually done a policy scan for a few communities related to this. So we look to see, okay, what are your local governments that actually control the food environment? In one community in particular, we thought it was the county commission, but in fact the Park and Rec department or board, the Park and Recreation Commission was the people they're the folks who actually control that environment. And so just figuring out who's actually the decision maker is something that we can help you do. We've also looked, with the web tools that we have in our legal databases to try and figure out if you already have any nutritional standards or policies that affect the food environment. And that can be really helpful because you might already have a great, strong policy that you can just add language to. Many of you are in a different situation where we're starting from scratch, but at the very least, understanding kind of what what exists on the books now is going to be really critical. And I'll just point out, our role in trying to gather up the existing landscape, the existing policies, can be fairly limited to what is available on the internet, what is available in our legal databases. And so this is also a question that we're asking you to be asking your coalition partners. If you have coalition partners who are on the county board or who are on the city council or who are city clerks, asking them to identify any existing written guidances on the food environment can be critical, and then providing those to us is going to be really important. So we're going to kind of summarize what sort of resources we're creating at the end, but just know that for the governmental nutrition standards, we're going to have a real robust document that's going to be prepared by several of our TA partners, not just the Public Health Law Center, to really try and help you wade through what the various standards are and how to best pick the ones that work for your community, and then how that then translates into policy, what that language looks like. And we're doing the same thing for healthy vending bids and contracts. And when I say vending, I have been starting to use the word vending as well as concessions. Legally, in Kansas, vending means a lot of different things. It means vending machines, but it also means concessions, so things sold, for example, at a pool, prepared foods on site. Often they are things like hot dogs and burgers or nachos, but they can be even meals that are sold on site in some of the larger facilities. Pizza is another big one. And so what we found is that, and two communities have picked this as their policy priority, because what we found is that sometimes you don't need a city council to pass a resolution with nutrition standards. Instead, you could actually go to the bid that goes out to a vendor who's providing the food and update that with really strong nutritional standards. And, you know, I think that the interplay between our previous policy priority of governmental nutrition standards and this is going to be really, there's going to be a lot of overlap for the folks that are working on these two policy priorities, because the language is going to look very similar. A language that you would have in a governmental policy, you're going to want to mimic that language in a bid or an RFP, and then once that RFP has been responded to by a vendor, incorporated into the contracts. And so what we've been doing is identifying any existing RFPs or bids in a local government that is working on this issue. Sometimes we don't find it. The communities have found it. One community in particular identified that there was an RFP that was actually going to go out in the next 2 months for concessions at park and recreation facilities. And so that was a real unique opportunity to try and get their foot in the door to try and impact this current RFP, but also to build momentum over the course of the next 3 years to really get robust standards in the next RFP that would be happening in the next 3 years. So one of the things that we found in this policy priority is that it's really important to understand your existing landscape. For example, I mentioned this before, but one of the groups thought they were going to work on this. They were going to work on contracts and bids, or going to work on RFPs. So they were going to look to see what contracts currently existed and when they were going to be putting back out to the community for an RFP. Well, they found out that their government actually didn't have any contracts with any vendors. Instead, employees went to Sam's Club or Costco, or they went to their local food shelf or got donations for food. And so there really wasn't a mechanism to work on this policy priority. So this can be really important for those of you who are working on this to get the contracts, to figure out when the contracts will expire, and then that will help the timeline and understand your current landscape and context. And for resources, we actually have gathered several existing RFPs and contracts in local communities around the country. And we find this pretty helpful because there are a lot of models out there that are great, great model nutritional standards, and we even have a couple model contracts. But what we've learned, especially from governmental procurement offices and attorneys, is that they want to see what other people have done. They don't want to see a model. They want to see how has the city of Amityville in New York implemented this at their pool. What does their RFP look like? What does their contract look like? And so we're gathering those examples and helping vet those examples for, really kind of best practices. And we've identified things like nutrition standards are important, but you have to have other pieces like pricing language so that your healthy food isn't so much more, double what your unhealthy food is. There's also things you can do with contracts related to advertising that you can't really do with governmental policies, like a ordinance or a resolution. And so we're getting all that information together, and we're really going to dive in and provide some resources in October. But we encourage you to kind of be thinking about other resources that might be helpful in your efforts for this policy priority as well as some others. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Mary to talk about the community and the resources for the land bank policy.
Great, thanks, Natasha. As Natasha mentioned, we do have one community that has identified a land bank policy as their policy priority, and this has been a really exciting project for me to work on, just because there's so many different facets of a land bank that come into play. And I know that the vision and goal of this community is how to preserve and take back blighted or nuisance property that has kind of fallen out of use or become almost a detriment to the community, and bring it back into the community as a productive, useful resource. And while the focus is, primarily on increasing access to healthy food through using these properties, either creating green spaces, community gardens, looking at maybe some small ag opportunities with these resources, but also I think that a land bank policy touches on a lot of other needs that a community might have when looking at how their land resources are being used. And so it'll be really interesting to see how we navigate this and bring in a lot of other community interests, because land is such a valuable resource for communities and ties into different economic interests, both housing, commercial zoning, a lot of different ways that a land bank policy can be used to promote shared community goals, and specifically to further and promote access to healthy food. And so we're working with this community to initially just get some information about the land banks, kind of doing assessment of how land banks can be used as a tool to further these kinds of community goals, and examples looking at what's been done in Kansas and also other communities around the country and similar situations, both for what might fit a rural Kansas context, and ways that we might be able to think creatively of new approaches and things. And so there's questions about how is the land bank structured, what governmental entities may be involved in a land bank, who needs to be at the table. I mean, when you get into this real property and property interests, there can be some interesting legal issues that might come up, whether, like if is the land truly abandoned, who has a property interest, tax forfeited properties. There's a lot of different ways that land might be in disuse or become a blighted property in the community, and so how can those lands be brought into a land bank, and navigating some of those legal and policy issues that come into play with real property that is a little bit different than I think some other types of resources that communities have. In addition, this community is really thinking broadly about how to work with different governmental entities. So some of what I was talking about earlier with interlocal agreements. So, a land bank can possibly, work within different local governments, both maybe the county, also different cities, and how can a land bank accommodate or address the needs of preserving property in both of those governmental entities. And then also there have been some interesting questions that have come up as to how to work with tribal governments, and what kinds of agreements or ways can like local Kansas communities and governments work with tribal communities around shared interests and shared resources to promote this access to healthy food through land preservation as part of a land bank. So there's some really, I think, interesting questions that we're exploring, and doing some research and trying to find resources to help direct this process as this community is getting going. Some other things that have come up have to do with things perhaps like water access, and then depending on where you are in Kansas, water access is an ongoing issue, whether it be the severe drought that you all have been recently experiencing to the torrential rains that parts of Kansas have seen, and still just managing the water resources that falls on different properties and doing that in a way that preserves resources for the community as a whole while protecting the land, I think, is really an important component of that. And then also there have been some questions that have come up as to how to work with brownfields or properties that may have some kind of contamination, whether, like maybe it's an old gas station or something that's been abandoned and there's like a leaking tank or some concerns about, well, if a land that has some contamination ends up being integrated or becomes part of the land bank, who's responsible for that cleanup, what kind of liability issues might come up. I think that there's a lot of really important considerations that come into play in the development of a land bank and identifying what properties are appropriate and how to manage some of the problems that have led to a specific parcel of property or land becoming blighted or become a public nuisance. So, so there's a lot of great work, I think, that can be done with the land bank policy, and we'll be putting together some resources and moving this forward. I think this community really has some really exciting and innovative ideas.
And with that, just in sum, we want to talk about some of the resources that are being developed. Mary mentioned several different kind of legal research projects that we're working on, and I think it probably doesn't escape your notice that we're working on a lot of policy priorities that you in your community may not be working on as part of HCI for your grant, but you might be working on in your other, as you wear other hats for other grants or other efforts. And so, we're hoping that this information really helps move efforts for healthy food access forward for a lot of different folks, even though we're doing it to provide technical assistance for HCI communities. I think, the idea is that it adds to kind of the movement in Kansas to, bring healthy food to all parts of Kansas. And so we're coming at it from a couple different ways. I think that's probably clear from what we're talking about. First, we want to make sure that we understand your local context. So looking at existing structures, that means governmental structures, existing committees or councils, understanding kind of what is on the books. Now, you're going to be knowledgeable about what's actually happening, the politics of your community, that sort of thing, but we help you identify and analyze what exists currently in law and also kind of in that informal governmental policy like work site policy and that sort of thing. So we're doing that very targeted, in-depth analysis for you, as we find things on the websites and also as you are able to gather it from your coalition partners. In addition, we're identifying themes where we create kind of more broadly accessible resources. So, we do, on the local level, we do a memo that analyzes what your local food environment looks like, but then we're going to be creating these fact sheets, or maybe even we'll develop into a toolkit for how you actually work to further nutritional standards at the local level in Kansas. And I think one of the most important things that we're doing is actually making it relevant to Kansas. So there are a lot of resources right now that are national in scope, or they're being created for an individual state. Like, Iowa has some great resources, North Carolina has great resources, but it doesn't include the Kansas context. It doesn't include what Kansas state law says. And I think that's really what we're going to be focusing on in the coming months, is getting those resources translated into what makes sense for Kansas. Based on Kansas law. So what does the Randolph-Shepard Act say in Kansas? How does that influence your work for affecting the food environment on governmental property? I mean, those are important questions that we're going to be developing resources, and that, just as a few of the resources. And we're going to be rolling out kind of a list of the resources that are in development, as well as some like the ones that we're developing now. We're going to be rolling those out in October. But I think one of the things we want to say and have you thinking about as we're presenting this information is, if you know of something that is going to help your community, you need to let us know. We can think of things that we think are useful, but really we want to have you guide our technical assistance. So if you've run into a legal barrier or a policy barrier, or you've heard something that seems like it might be an issue, let us know, and we'll try and kind of translate that into how it affects your policy priority and how to try and come up with solutions to that barrier or to that issue. All right, so now I'm going to pass it off to Mary so that she can go over active transportation.
Great. Just similar to what Natasha just went over as far as the different kinds of policy priorities communities have identified for healthy eating, we had a similar kind of process with those of you interested in active transportation. And so, we started off with kind of this menu of different types of policy priorities that you could pursue to promote and move active transportation forward in your community. And so I think that in our previous webinar, we kind of looked at this menu of different options. And now we have the communities have identified their specific policies. Next slide. So people have narrowed down their policy priorities to this menu. And so this chart shows where different communities have fallen out. And again, I just want to acknowledge that both Finney and Harvey County are really, really close to identifying what their actual policy priority is, and they maybe already have, and we just haven't heard that final confirmation from them. But they have indicated like a really strong interest in one of these policy priorities for active transportation. So the 5 active transportation policy priorities that people have identified range from comprehensive plans to complete streets policy, a kind of a takeoff of a comprehensive plan, a more focused master bike or pedestrian plan, working with an active transportation council, and then also integrating active transportation design standards into the transportation system in a community. And so I'll go through these quickly here. So one area that a lot of that folks have been really interested in is this working with the comprehensive planning process and looking for ways to integrate active transportation, access to pedestrians, bikes, and other non-motorized transportation into their planning process, and having it be a visioning tool, and also how to integrate specific policy components and implementation into that process. So as part of that, with the comprehensive plan, what we've done is we've been going through specific comprehensive plans, both in Kansas counties and cities, to identify ways in which active transportation, pedestrian biking, or other things could be integrated into the planning process. I think that this is really, I mean, some communities landed on comprehensive plan because like they're actually in the process, their communities are in the process of updating their comprehensive plan, and so it seemed like it was just like the timing was just right to focus on what was at hand and to try to really influence and inform that process. So different things that can come up in a comprehensive plan that we're developing resources on can include, a sidewalk improvement district, and so we're developing some resources in that. Some communities are really interested, even though they've identified active transportation as their area, they also don't want to lose sight of the goal of increasing access to healthy food. And so some folks are really interested in identifying ways in which active transportation and the comprehensive plan can also lend its support to access to healthy food, either through looking at how access to farmers market may be integrated into like a regional trail system and sidewalks or parks, maybe different zoning requirements at the local government level that can help bring the world of active transportation together with the world of healthy food access. And I think that this is actually a really exciting approach to think, globally, even as you're focused on a certain area, not to lose sight of the other needs that your community has to promote health. And I know that like all of you are working on so many different areas, and as part of the HCI effort, we're asking you to focus on one policy priority, but there are opportunities that come up even in your specific policy area that might lend itself to supporting other goals of your community. So we're just keeping our eyes open for those things as well. Another area of the comprehensive plan has to do with, sorry, Natasha's controlling the slide, so she's trying to anticipate when I'm ready to switch gears. But a couple other things that have come up with the comprehensive plan process is looking at different local governmental authority to raise funds for different transportation initiatives, whether it be sidewalks or trail systems or things like that, and then also really identifying how the local authority, the authority that local governments have to impact the transportation system, either through speed limits, crosswalks, signage, things like that, that may, sometimes local governments may have some limitations depending on if it's a state road or a county road, or who has authority over those different transportation components. But a comprehensive plan can lay out a framework, depending on what the authority of the local government is to address some of the needs the community have. All right. Complete streets policies is another area that a community has identified, and I'll let Natasha talk about this because I think that she's been working with that community.
Yes, and I think, this is probably I should have said this before. So Mary and I, you've been talking to Mary or me on phone calls, and we initially just started out by assigning ourselves kind of randomly to your communities. And as you have settled in on the various policy priorities, we are restructuring how which communities we're each assigned to. And so essentially I will be working with the communities assigned to healthy food access, except for the land bank community, and then Mary is going to be working to try and find the synergies between your policy work on active transportation. And so that's the way that we've really decided to help, try to maximize our work and the connections that we can draw on your work through each other. So, but I have been working on providing some technical assistance to communities on Complete Streets. And one of the things that we found with Complete Streets is this is a great policy priority for those who don't have a clear idea of what specific policy priority they want. So for example, they want to affect the transportation environment overall, but there isn't a zoning subdivision sidewalk ordinance that they want to work on, or there isn't, or maybe they want to work on that, but they want to work on many policies. So the idea is that Complete Streets policy is more like an umbrella. It provides an opportunity to pass a comprehensive ordinance that, with a very strong implementation plan, that can impact policies throughout that local government, from the kind of the ordinances all the way through the design standards that the local planners choose to use. And so Complete Streets policies is more of a kind of a framework, a catch-all for a lot of active transportation policies. And so some of the work that we've been doing with communities is to try and, again, map that kind of local context. But we also created a memo that really looked into whether or not Complete Streets policies made sense for rural communities. There was a question by one of our communities on, does it even make sense for us to do a Complete Streets policies? We're very rural. It seems like the examples that folks have been talking about, they're very urban in nature, and especially in Kansas. I mean, the more urban areas are the ones that are pursuing these Complete Streets policies. And so we did a memo looking nationally to see, okay, are there good examples where local governments have, in small rural communities, have actually passed Complete Streets legislation. And so we have that memo that we provided to that community, and that did help them eventually land on a kind of landing on the idea that they would like to, pursue a Complete Streets policy in their community. And so that's kind of another example of how we kind of look around the country to see, are there any examples that can help provide context for your work in your area, as well as as you pick your policy priority.
So another area that some folks are focusing on is the development of an active transportation council, and I think of it as kind of like a sister to the Food Policy Council, an entity, a committee that is charged with looking at the transportation system from a holistic and comprehensive approach, and identifying policy priorities and strategies and agendas to promote active transportation within that community. And I think that this Active Transportation Council has a lot of real potential, kind of like the Food Policy Council, and there's some really interesting ideas that folks have. And so one of the things that we're working on is doing a survey of different communities and looking at rural communities, like Natasha mentioned. That's really important to make sure that we have the rural context for those Kansas communities that are struggling with that rural piece, and as compared to the urban piece, with these councils and similar communities in Kansas or around the country who have established these kinds of active transportation councils, how they've been structured, who's in charge. I mean, kind of similarly to the Food Policy Council, there could be a question as to whether an active transportation council should be a governmental entity or perhaps a nonprofit entity. What are the strengths and weaknesses of that, and what are some lessons learned or guidance that we can take from the experience of other communities who have established this type of a council to really further the goals of active transportation. So we'll be putting together, or in the process of putting together, some of that information, and a lot of these things that we've also been talking about throughout this webinar will be rolling out more detail at the October convening. So another piece, too, that kind of ties into this active transportation council is this idea of a master bike ped plan. And different communities have identified this master bike pedestrian plan as a policy priority that is akin somewhat to the interest in the comprehensive plan, but it is a separate planning process that I think, as people are envisioning it, may complement or tie into a comprehensive planning process, or perhaps just kind of move forward on its own, depending on. I mean, some communities may not have a very up-to-date comprehensive planning process in their community, and so this master bike pedestrian planning process can really help to hone in on what the needs of the community are to promote active transportation, come up with a vision, a plan, implementation steps, identifying policy priorities, and I think a really important part of that, too, is the integration of community involvement in that. And one community is also really interested in looking at the interplay between a master bike pedestrian plan and the active transportation committee, kind of seeing it as like the plan might establish the committee, or the committee might be charged with establishing the plan. And I think that it'll be really interesting to see how that evolves, and what the kind of the mix of those two approaches might be in moving forward, because, I mean, a plan is only as good as its implementation and the community involvement, and a council is only as good as, having clearly defined objectives and a plan to move forward. And so I see this master bike pedestrian plan and the active transportation committee as being kind of two sides of the same coin. So then, and then finally, there's, I think, a couple of communities that are interested in active transportation design standards, and I think that this is a really great process for communities to work on, and especially what we've seen is that working and identifying active transportation design standards is oftentimes a really important step of moving a complete streets policy forward. It gives kind of like some meat to the bones of a complete streets policy. So identifying what specific design standards a community wants to integrate into their complete streets efforts or their street design is essential to ensuring that actually bikes and pedestrians have access to the city transportation system, that it's safe, and that all transportation users understand how bikes and pedestrians fit in to the bigger system. And so these design standards are a critical tool, and some of the things that we're going to be working on is like where how can a community integrate design standards into their transportation system? What governmental agency or department should be involved in those conversations? What are the best design standards, kind of like the nutrition standards that Natasha mentioned earlier? Like all design standards aren't created equal, and so you're trying to understand, well, what fits best, and it might be different depending on where your community is. If you're in a more urban area, there might be design standards that are more appropriate as opposed to a more rural setting. And so depending on what the community needs are, we're going to be kind of diving into that, trying to understand what the best design standards are, best practices, and working with some probably with some outside experts to help us identify those. Where do the design standards fit into the policy landscape of the community, and then what does the implementation schedule or process really look like? And so, I mean, through my discussion of different active transportation policy areas, I've been mentioning some of the different resources that we're developing. I mean, we are looking at things from how to integrate resources, identifying how to integrate active transportation in comprehensive plans, the structure and makeup of an active transportation council, how an master bike ped plan looks in different models for urban versus rural communities. There's a whole host of possibilities, I think, in providing resources to you. And so, as Natasha mentioned, if there are specific needs that you have or ways that you think that we can support your efforts, we really invite you to reach out to us, let us know what would be most helpful to you. And it's really great because the whole technical assistance team comes with such a wide array of background, expertise, and also contacts with other technical assistance providers. So like in the planning field, like I think that there's going to be some really great resources that we can reach out to help build on what the technical assistance team has to offer.
All right, and so with that, I'm noticing that we have used the whole hour, and so I think we're just going to reiterate that the October training is going to be a great time for you to ask questions and of each other as well as for us. But we are interested, I know, in the next half hour, Sean's going to lead a discussion to figure out kind of what makes the most sense for you, what sort of needs have you identified that we can help you with. Those are the sorts of kind of discussions we're hoping to have in the next half hour.
And this is Mary. I'm just going to jump in. I am going to be going to the session with Mark Winnie here at this Food Access Summit, so I won't be on the call later on. So if you have any specific questions for me, Natasha can field those, and I can get back to you specifically if you need any follow-up. So I look forward to talking with all of you soon, and I hope you have a great rest of your conversation this afternoon.
All right, so with that, I'll turn it back to, I think, Vicki or Jeff. I don't know who I'm turning it back to.
That's fine, Natasha. But Sean, Jeff, have there been any questions that anyone has typed in before we go any further?
No one has typed any questions yet, but if anyone has questions, please feel free to do so, and then we'll go through those and give an opportunity for answers.
Okay. Well, this is Vicki James. I'm just going to make a few reminders and save the date type of information. So if you do have any questions for Natasha, type those in now, and Sean and Jeff can relay those to Natasha. And if you don't have any, think about it. You can always connect with Natasha and Mary later, and we'll have a great opportunity to do that in October as well. Reminders that I would make for you. Our next webinar, again, will be the second Wednesday of every month, so it will be September 11th. And one of our favorites, Stephen Hardy with Mind Mixer out of Kansas City, will be back to join us. And as you know, Stephen really is an expert with city planning, city policy, public engagement, urban design, best practices for community design, and really that community process. And he's been introduced to Mary and Natasha and have had some conversations and will continue to do that, so that Public Health Law Center in tandem with Stephen will be able to provide some in-state, very specific resources and time and technical assistance, whether it's by webinar, telephone, maybe some regional site meetings which have been alluded to, or actually in your community to really help you with the customized TA that you may need to take your policy priority forward. So Stephen will be doing our September 11th webinar, and it will be created, the content will be created along with Mary and Natasha for what those customized needs are for those of you that are seeking policies related to active transportation. And Mary did a great job of explaining something I wanted to mention. For those of you whose policy priority currently is related to access for healthy foods, if you heard her say this can all work in tandem. When we're talking about healthy eating and active living in a community, then these do cross over. So even if you're working on things with healthy eating, we hope that you will see and think about with Stephen's presentation how what you're doing with access to healthy food can really cross over and work with active transportation. So you'll receive the invitation. We encourage you to be there for the September 11th webinar. I'm very excited to share that we have 13 teams sending between 1 and 6 people to Lawrence on August 28th and 29th for our food system convening. Thank you. I just want to acknowledge, I think the leadership teams heard what we said. If you are not specifically working on a policy priority directly related to the food system or food hub, you did a great job of identifying other people on your coalition or in your community who are working or have the passion and the energy and the desire to develop this work in your community. So we're very excited about the diversity of stakeholders attending, and really, really encourage those of you to communicate across the network with each other as you get back and share this. Don't keep it just to yourselves, but share. So
We have about 50 folks coming, plus resource people. Will be full house, about 90 people, and have a delightful day planned. So if you're not in attendance, if you can't go, registration is closed, but you'll be able to connect back with our teams, and Natasha, Claudia and Adrian, Sean and Jeff and I will all be there, so you'll be able to receive a lot of resources later on that. Also an announcement, September 25th and 26th this year is the Built Environment and Outdoors Summit, and it is in Topeka. It is on the SharePoint calendar where you can click and get more details. There will not be any financial support from the Kansas Health Foundation this year as there was last, but it's still a conference that some of you want to consider. Last announcement is October 2nd, 3rd, and 4th will be our next convening of all 20 of our teams. You will be encouraged to invite 3 people from your leadership team, and if you're trying to decide who that should be, we suggest that key members of your leadership team that are really the priority folks to help move your policy priority forward would be the first ones to consider. If we have more space and you want to bring more people, we can check with you on that a little closer to time as registrations come in. And those of you that are key contacts in your leadership teams, look for an email invite within the next week with registration information. So October 2nd, 3rd, and 4th, we look forward to getting all of us together. A great time for networking, but also very customized efforts with technical assistance related directly to your policy priority that you've chosen. I think that's all the announcements I have today. This webinar will be archived within about a week, and we'll stop the webinar recording now and turn it over to Sean, who will lead us through some discussion.
Hello, everyone. This is Sean, and I just wanted to let you know that this is the time that we've got designated for you to be able to share what's happening in your leadership team, your community, and to be able to connect with other teams to address any issues or concerns that you may have. And so it's just really designed to be a very, very casual conversation. And Natasha is remaining on the line, so if you have a question further or something comes up, feel free to type that into the box, and we will give you an opportunity to have that question addressed. And so for today, Katie Ross from the Reno County team is going to share a little bit about what's happening in her community, and she also had a question. And bear with me one second while I unmute Katie. And Katie, go ahead with your question if you don't mind, and then we'll go ahead in terms of a little bit of discussion in terms of what's happening there in Reno.
Sure.
Go ahead.
Can you hear me? Okay. We have been in the process of working on, we passed a Complete Streets policy a year ago, and the wording probably wasn't as strong as it could have been in the midst of that process, and we're in the midst of having a new edition, housing development that's being put together, and it's gone through a couple of different committees, and they really don't want to put sidewalks on both sides of the street, and we do have a problem with the amount of housing that we have locally, and so it's going to be coming before the City Council, and we, the Public Health Law Center has been nice enough to put together some talking points for us and some benefits of having sidewalks on both sides. Right now they're just looking at doing on one side, and how important it is for the sales of the home, and trying to talk with the people about this. When we were meeting yesterday, one of the concerns that came up, and this is kind of where the question comes in, we have, in the midst of all of this, we are working on putting together some sidewalk regulations within the new subdivision regulations for the future, but when they were talking about it, it'll probably not be completed until after this goes to a vote. So our concern is if they don't end up passing this, because again, housing is such an issue here, what we could, if there's other ideas, if people had, if like we could get grants or find financial parts of that to just get the sidewalks in and kind of do it under the radar. We didn't know if there was other ideas of things that could be done to at least have this set as a standard that sidewalks are on both sides of the street moving forward until we get this into our subdivision regulations.
Is Natasha there?
Yep. I mean, I think I don't know about grants. So because we provided information about this for purposes of policy change. I think, yeah. So I feel like there is. I know that you had talked about just working directly with the builder, or that is, obviously kind of a very easy way around having to have a policy change for that individual subdivision is to actually work with the folks who are building and getting their sign-off and actually having, and this is not my expertise, so I'm reaching out to the other TA providers because engage, like kind of that relationship mapping exercise to try and get to him or her.
We have actually spoken to him. This is another part of this.
Yeah.
And there's been a couple of different people who have tried to talk to him about the fact that, as a group, we would really like to work on making this kind of the standard and then also turning him into kind of the, look at how great he's done for the community and making housing that has sidewalks on both sides and doing quite a bit to help him sell the homes. And he is very much not really about there being anybody telling him that he needs to have sidewalks or tell him what to do for his job. He should be able to do his job, and we should just stay out of it. So we have tried on a couple of different occasions to correspond with him in a confrontational way, just to kind of see what his thoughts are. I mean, and part of our concern, and I agree with you on the policy, but we don't know how long it'll be before another subdivision comes in. I mean, honestly, it could be 10 years. That's how long it's been between some of our last ones. And so our biggest concern is a missed opportunity for this to be used. And then, but we also recognize we don't really know how to, I mean, we could probably come up with the, money for this, but is that going to set us back because we're just paying for it and we don't want to set that as the standard? So we're kind of at a loss, I guess, a little bit on how to, in case that they don't pass it with City Council.
Yeah, Mary and I have, and I know you guys have, did you already have your council meeting this?
No, it's actually, they pushed it back. It looks like it'll be September before they do it.
Because Mary and I could actually bring this up with Stephen. I think that is a good question for him. But I also think, one of the things that when we were doing the research on this topic, to be honest, is we couldn't find anything like that absolutely. In our materials, we couldn't find anything that was really specific on sidewalks on both sides.
Okay.
It was one of those kind of almost luxuries that, we're fighting in many communities to get sidewalks at all. And so to have sidewalks on one side is, you can almost think of it like half the battle has been won, because at least there's a sidewalk for each street.
Okay.
Now, best case scenario is it's on both sides. But I don't know if anyone else on the call from other communities has comments or any of the other TA providers, but I can bring that back to Mary, who is kind of the lead on this, as well as we reach out to other TA providers.
Okay.
Yeah. This is Jeff at the foundation, and I was wondering if there's any research out there. I mean, this could be an opportunity to, basically educate a organizational leader who happens to be a developer around the economic benefits of having sidewalks on both sides. I'm not sure there is, but there might be some data out there that would indicate the economic benefits of developing. So it may be easier for them to sell the properties. It may increase the value of the property. Those kinds of things.
We couldn't. This is Natasha. We couldn't find anything. I mean, we had in that memo we put together, we found all these resources that talked about from a perspective of when you have sidewalks in a neighborhood, there's an economic benefit. A very strong one, actually. There's a lot of research that supports that. But it's not specific to both sides. That's what so if anyone else has seen that resource, please forward along so we could add it to that memo.
Okay.
And we've got a comment here from Scott. And Scott, I can unmute you now, and you can make your comment here. Scott, go ahead. Are you still there? And if not, Scott's comment was several of the leadership competencies. seem to be applicable in this situation.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So absolutely, and that was a great question, Katie. We really appreciate that. And one thing I'd like to do is to go ahead and just talk a little bit about, Katie, what's been happening there in Reno, and how you basically were able to come to the policy decision that you came to.
Okay. Yeah, we did, again,